We're going to break away from the last minute or two of this and get you live down to Houston, Texas at Rice University, where former President Barack Obama will sit down with former Secretary of State James Baker and presidential historian Jon Meacham. They'll discuss their experiences in office, bipartisanship, and U.S. leadership abroad. Going to take you live now to Houston, Texas on C-SPAN 2.
Thank you, thank you. Mr. President, welcome to Texas.
It's good to be back in Houston. Congratulations on the Texans' victory yesterday.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. They beat the Titans, so no, sir. We don't want that. As I like to say, Tennesseans like to point out that if it weren't for us, y'all would still be part of Spain. So you can thank us later. I made that joke to George W. Bush when he was governor, and he went, "That's pretty funny, asshole." So,
if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't be saying y'all either.
Well, that's a good point, sir. I'll defer to that, absolutely. I'm honored to be here. President Reagan, whom Secretary Baker served so wonderfully and so well, used to say that when he was in Hollywood, he would get a call to come to a dinner to speak and perform, and Reagan would say, "But I don't sing or dance." And the organizer would say, "Well, we know, but you can introduce someone who can." So my job is to introduce two people who can. And wanted to start with Secretary Baker and thank him for the remarkable institute, but even more important, the half century of service to America and to the world. And
thank you.
It is, as someone who spends most of his time thinking about the past and talking to dead people, and it's when they talk back that you're in trouble, I must say that it's hard to imagine, and it's a great tribute to our country, that two such different people come to the pinnacle of power and are able to lead the nation and the world in such a remarkable way. We have a man from Texas and Princeton and a Marine who served Republican administrations. We have the 44th President of the United States from Hawaii by way of the Ivy League. And what brings them together is, I think, what brings the country together, which is a shared sense that we have to push forward to a more perfect union. And so the subject of a more perfect union is what I'd like to talk about tonight. So, Mr. Secretary, ordinarily, of course, the President would go first, but in an age before beauty moment, I'd like to...
You got that right.
I'd like to ask, so what I'd like for us to talk about is how the world worked on your watches, how Washington worked on your watches, and how they didn't work, and what can we learn from both those positive and negative experiences. And so, just for narrative purposes, sir, when you went to Washington in 1981 as Chief of Staff, what was the ambient reality of Washington for you? It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a great bipartisan Valhalla. There were tough fights. But what was it like? What did it feel like? How hard was it to get things done?
Thank you, John. Before I answer that question, or try to, let me simply say that, Mr. President, you honor us by being here tonight, and we're very, we're very appreciative and very grateful for your being here. We were having dinner, and when Ed Derigian was announcing all those big dollar numbers, I looked at the president. I said, "Mr. President, 10% of that's yours." He said, "The hell it is. I'm not letting you off that cheap." He said, "I want the Rolodex." So anyway.
And Jim still uses a Rolodex, by the way.
So, John, what was it like? Well, it was, I think it's fair to say, considerably different than it is today. It was not, as you pointed out, not a big kumbaya moment where everybody would agree to everything. I worked for a president who was considered to be quite an ideologue. In fact, he was considered to be such a hard-line conservative. He used to joke. He used to tell people, you know, our administration is so conservative that the right wing never knows what the far right wing is doing. But he was able to reach across the aisle. People forget this, but President Reagan had a Democratic House for his entire presidency, all 8 years. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House, and he and President Reagan really didn't see anything hardly eye to eye on policy, but they both, I think, arrived in Washington wanting to get something done for the country. And they'd fight like hell during the day, and at night they would retire somewhere at 5 o'clock, start telling Irish jokes and drinking bourbon, and they found ways to cooperate and ways to get the nation's business done. In foreign policy, I think it was a much easier time, perhaps. Although in saying that, I want to make it clear, nobody should have any nostalgia for the Cold War. I'm old enough to remember those days when we had drills as school kids hiding under our desks because nuclear annihilation was a distinct threat. So in foreign policy, perhaps we had it a little bit easier in formulating the policy because we knew what we were for. We were for whatever the Soviets were against, and we were against whatever the Soviets were for. But the implementation of that policy was extremely difficult, even back in those days, just as it is today. So things were different. I think that perhaps a few more things got done on a bipartisan basis. I'm reminded of on domestic policy of how President Reagan's 1986 Tax Reform Act was passed with Democratic votes. And it was a tax reform, by the way. There was a true tax reform. It didn't jack up the budget deficit or the debt, the unsustainable debt of the United States. It was revenue neutral. And how also he and Tip O'Neill were able to come together to protect, for 30 years at least, the financial solvency of Social Security by Republicans giving a little bit more in contributions in taxes, Democrats giving a little bit more in jacking up the retirement age. And it worked. It worked for 30 years. So I really do believe it was, and from the standpoint of bipartisanship, which I know is an issue that's dear to President Obama's heart, there were perhaps more opportunities to see some of that happen. It didn't happen totally in foreign policy. When President Bush, 41, decided he was going to reverse Iraqi aggression in Kuwait, both the House and the Senate were controlled by Democrats, and both said, no, you're not. This is not something we ought to do. How many lives is it worth, Mr. Secretary, to do what you want to do, that sort of thing? But President Bush was wise enough and adroit enough to go out and get the rest of the world on board first, and then he was able to bring the Congress along. He wanted the Congress, not that he thought he needed it, because he thought he could do it under his commander-in-chief powers, but he wanted the Congress in order to be able to say he had the support of the American people.
Mr. President, you took power in 16 years after the Reagan-Bush 41 era. Pretty clearly, something happened in the 1990 to 94 period, the rise of Gingrichism and the revolt against 41 in 1990. How much of Secretary Baker's description of Washington was true for you when you came to power, and how much does it sound like we're describing Thermopylae?
Not much. But first, let me compliment Jim, not only for the extraordinary work that's being done here at the Institute, as well as the ambassador and all those who support what you're doing. I had a chance to meet some of the young people who are interning here, and the excitement that they have about the prospect of serving their country in various ways, got me excited and inspired. But also let me compliment Jim for the extraordinary service that he rendered the country. And I had the pleasure of visiting my buddy 41 briefly this afternoon, and I've said this to you, Jim, or John, in the book that you wrote, and I continue to believe it. I think when it comes to foreign policy, the work that President George H.W. Bush did with Jim at his side was as important and as deft and as effective a set of foreign policy initiatives as we saw in recent years, and deserve enormous credit for navigating the end of the Cold War in a way that could have gone sideways all kinds of ways. One of the challenges is when you're president or working for a president is you don't always get credit when nothing happens. And nothing happening is good.
That's right.
A lot of times. So now, what I would say is that by the time, and what I'm saying here is not particularly original, but I think is accurate. By the time I took office, there were a number of trends that had started to advance what some commentators are calling the great sorting. And what I mean by that is that when Jim arrives in Washington in 1981, you still had a whole bunch of conservative Democrats, many of them from the South. You had Republicans, many from the North, who were extraordinarily liberal on environmental issues or civil rights issues, on a whole range of topics. And political scientists used to get angry about the fact that American parties don't make any sense. There's just this hodgepodge of various interest groups that are all kind of stuck together, and there's not always any rhyme or reason for it. But the advantage of that was that you had an overlapping ideological spectrum in each party, so that there were going to be some Democrats you could have a conversation with who in turn were going to put some pressure on Tip O'Neill because they said, doggone it, if I'm trying to keep my seat in Tennessee, you're going to have to give a little bit because Reagan's really popular down there. And conversely, Democrats would have to deal with the fact that there were going to be some Republicans who they could reach across the aisle because actually they had the same view on certain issues. There are a range of reasons why that changed. Some of it had to do with, frankly, the shift in the media. Because in 1981, your news cycle was still governed by the stories that were going to be filed by AP, Washington Post, maybe New York Times, and the 3 broadcast stations.
Right.
And whether it was Cronkite or Brinkley or what have you, there was a common set of facts a baseline around which both parties had to adapt and respond to. And by the time I take office, what you increasingly have is a media environment in which, if you are a Fox News viewer, you have an entirely different reality than if you are a New York Times reader. It means the bases of each respective party have become more ideological. It means that because of gerrymandering, members of Congress now are entirely secure that they'll win their seat if they get the nomination. What they've got to worry about is, do I have somebody from farther to my right or farther to my left who's going to run against me in a primary? Mm-hmm. They then are not willing to stray from whatever the party line has become. You've got folks like Limbaugh and others who are enforcing what they consider to be ideological purity of some sort. And when you combine that with the perpetual campaign that is fueled by highly ideological, very wealthy donors, what you had by the time I arrive is a Congress that has difficulty getting out of campaign mode and into governance mode. And we saw that even when we were in the midst of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. You know, I still feel bad for Charlie Crist, down in Florida, the governor, hugely popular, but hadn't gotten the memo that he wasn't supposed to cooperate with me. Right. And supported the Recovery Act at a time when the economy was contracting faster than it did during right after the crash in 29. And the poor guy, you know, he's looking at it, he says, well, this is good for Florida. Our housing market's tanking. You know, I need to make sure that we shore things up. Our budget is imploded. We need the federal help. This makes sense. And you know, I think the fact that I kind of gave him a little bro hug, you know, that was it. I mean, you know,
Typhoid Mary of red states.
No, I mean, I felt bad for the guy. Because he became a cause célèbre inside of the Republican media, or the Limbaugh Fox News media world, which is how Marco Rubio got elected, essentially was saying you are not a true believer. And I think the challenge that we continue to have, it's gotten worse, not better now with the internet and all these things taking place, is one of the things you discovered as president is that the post-World War II order that was constructed by FDR and Truman and Eisenhower and George Marshall, that basic notion of liberal, not liberal in partisan terms, but a pluralistic, liberal, market-based, rule of law-based democracy, and those sets of universal principles, Democratic and Republican leaders believed in those things. And that's the running thread, basically from 1945 all the way through Reagan. There were certain ideas that Jim, regardless of how it was viewed, whether this is far right or right, there were certain ideals that you assumed you had to follow because that was part of American leadership in the world, and it was part of what made us a great country. Those are now being contested, in part because of the fact that we don't have this common base of information. And I think that the biggest challenge we're going to have over the next 10, 15, 20 years is to return to a civic conversation in which if I say this is a chair, we agree that this is a chair. We can disagree on whether it's a nice chair, whether we should replace the chair, whether you want to move it over there, but we can't say it's an elephant.
I thought we were against Obama chair.
Yeah. That was a good chair, by the way. I noticed the folks who tried to move it this last election didn't have a good time. Anyway, but I do. One thing I realized when I got to Congress, which is part of the reason I didn't stay very long, is that, and I'm making a great generalization. There's some wonderful people in Congress, but the fact is that members of Congress are primarily motivated around keeping their seat.
Yeah.
And it's getting worse and worse.
And, you know, I can't tell you how many times during my presidency I would have former colleagues of mine in the Senate who are good people and sensible people come up and say, Mr. President, I'd love to help you, but I'd get killed doing this. And I think that kind of pressure, Jim, I may be mistaken, wasn't as
no, it wasn't.
That didn't exist, at least not on every vote. Every once in a while, you'd get an ideological vote that, okay, the leader would come in and he'd say, look, you got to toe the line here. But that was not on every single item in the way it is today.
I totally agree with that, Mr. President. I think another way to say it really, perhaps, is that the responsible center in American politics has disappeared. And it's because of it's due to a lot of things. First of all, we're a pretty evenly divided country, red state, blue state. We do have the constitutional requirement to redistrict. If you live in a state dominated by Republicans, they're going to draw more and more safe districts on the right. On Democrats, more and more safe districts on the left. People that go to Washington today to represent us, particularly in the Congress, no longer take their families up there. There is no longer any social interaction in Washington between the two parties. And lastly, the last thing, or maybe not quite lastly, but next to last, you have the advent of the internet. Right. I mean, that really makes it easy to be divisive. Divisiveness sells. Comity doesn't sell. If you can get somebody to say something outrageous, that person can get on TV, right?
Right.
So, and lastly, I got to tell you, I think part of this problem is the responsibility of the media. Our media today are no longer objective reporters of the facts the way they were when I was there. They are, as you pointed out, they are players. They're players. You tune in to Fox News, you'd think you were listening to the House organ of the Republican Party. Tune in to MSNBC, you'd know you were listening to the House organ of the Democratic Party.
Oh, you see how he changed that around from the
I know you would.
Think versus you know. See, those kind of slick moves are what made Baker so effective.
That's why we're here.
That's exactly right. Don't think, I know you've been around a little longer, Jim, but
maybe I should have said CNN, not MSNBC.
Well, it is the observation you made about not moving families there. Look, when I was a senator, I didn't move my family there, in part, by the way, for a healthy reason, which is a lot of spouses now have careers, right? And so Michelle was like, yo, I got a job. But part of it, though, Jim, I think is also that there is there's the perpetual campaign that takes place, right, which puts enormous pressure on every member of Congress. They know they're being watched every minute. They're being scorecarded and graded by whatever ideological group is out there every single minute.
Right.
They don't feel like they can afford to be away from their. If they move their families, somebody's going to say, the guy's gone to Washington. He doesn't believe, that we're important anymore. And so you create this hothouse atmosphere in which folks are running scared all the time. And the ability to step back and reflect, to compromise, is reduced. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say that the gerrymandering issue is a solvable problem, Jim, unlike some of these issues. I mean, there are larger forces at work that are also creating this great sorting. We have an economy that has created differences of opportunity in urban versus rural areas, for example. Right. Those trends, because of technology, globalization, a whole bunch of forces, probably are not going to reverse themselves anytime soon, and that has created divides in the country. But gerrymandering is one that you can actually solve. California shifted to a nonpartisan, independent commission that carries out gerrymandering. I am actually a strong proponent and have been supportive of Eric Holder's efforts to try to get more states to adopt a nonpartisan,
independent
line-drawing clause.
Yeah.
And by the way, I say that as when it comes to gerrymandering, it is absolutely true that Democrats do the same thing Republicans do. If they're in control, then they will try to maximize the number of seats they have, and vice versa. We are in Texas, by the way, which is a champion of some gerrymandering. It is a fundamentally non-democratic approach, because essentially what happens is the elected official chooses the voters rather than the other way around. And I actually, when people ask me what are a few things that can be done to improve the functioning of government, this is an area where you can actually have an impact, and in some states you're seeing referenda in which the average voter gets it. They think this is an important thing.
I agree with you, and I think if we could get, I agree with you that if we could get to the point that independent commissions would draw our district lines, it would be wonderful. The problem with that, Mr. President, is it means taking the power out of the hands of the politicians. And I don't know where it's going to work. I know it's beginning to work in California.
You know, you just had a referendum in Michigan passing this. So you're seeing citizen initiatives around this in part because they recognize what is currently in place is not working. Mm-hmm. And I have to, one thing I will say, my observations during the time I was in the White House. Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that the problem has to do with the people who are there. And if we just kick all the bums out, then it's going to get fixed. Now, there are some bums, don't get me wrong, who need to be kicked out. We will not mention names. I'm sure you've got a list, and I got a list, and some of them overlap, and some of them may not.
Some just got reelected.
Yeah, exactly. But I will tell you that if you don't change the incentive structures and the underlying dynamics, then we will continue to see these problems. Good people will burn out and get discouraged. And voters will continue to be frustrated. And what it does is, by the way, it leaves a vacuum then for those who garner attention through the most divisive, controversial, outlandish statements to win. And the challenge that we have, people ask me often, John, what surprised me most about the presidency? Yeah. It is the degree to which the United States underwrites the international order. It is not always in the obvious ways, but if there's a problem around the world, people do not call Moscow, they do not call Beijing, they call Washington. Even our adversaries expect us to solve problems and expect us to keep things running. And when you start getting dysfunction in Washington, in which it's difficult for decisions to get made and policy making to run in an orderly process, when what is one of our greatest assets, which is an extraordinary civil service, right? Career staff, let's say, at the State Department.
Right.
When that begins to get undermined, that doesn't just weaken our influence. It provides opportunities for disorder to start ramping up all around the world and ultimately makes us less safe and makes us less prosperous. So we have a stake in making sure that we have our act together enough, because everybody else is, whether they admit it or not, tends to follow our lead.
But there is a line between Dean Acheson. There's a spectrum, really. From Dean Acheson and George Marshall to Jim Baker to Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry. That was a coherent conversation among secretaries of state. You would be possibly over here on the spectrum or over here, but it was a coherent conversation, right? Were you surprised in the past 24, 28 months or so to see the attack? He's Voldemort. I'm not going to say his name.
He's what?
Voldemort.
That's right. You got to read Harry Potter novels to your kids to know what he's talking about. So,
with Baker, it's grandkids, but it's all right. But the institutions that the president's talking about, and the institutions that you drew on, the United Nations, 12 resolutions during the Gulf War, an extraordinary coalition, Madrid itself, the peace conference, those institutions were pretty effective through this man's presidency.
Right.
And now, really, and I'm not just being clever, over the last 2 years, we've begun to fear the breakdown of those institutions. Did you see that coming?
No, I did not see that coming, and I tend to agree with you. I certainly agree with you, and I know President Obama would agree with this, that American leadership in the world is absolutely imperative. No other country can do it. Everybody expects us to lead. Everybody expects us to lead, and we won the Cold War because every president from Harry Truman through George H.W. Bush was steadfast, whether they were Democrats or Republicans. We won the Cold War because we had alliances that leveraged our power and that we could rely on. And those alliances were evidenced by NATO, of course, but by our security agreements with Japan and Korea, in the economic sphere, the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. Those institutions were created by America in order for us to do what the rest of the world needed to have done and what was good for America. And I think it's still good for America. And I don't think we ought to be denigrating those institutions or attacking them. Do they need, some of them, reformation? Absolutely. As someone who spent a lot of time working with the IMF, there's a good one. The UN, there's another good one. Even NATO, this president is right in one respect for sure. NATO needs to, our European allies need to pay their way, what they've agreed to pay. And we shouldn't be required forever to pick up the tab on that. But these institutions make America stronger, and we ought not to be running them down.
Let me ask both of you, and Mr. President, you first. Here's like an exam question that they would have at Rice. Assess the validity of this statement, if you would. American politics between 1933 and 2017 can be understood as a kind of figurative conversation between Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. That the field on which we made most of our domestic and foreign policy decisions was about the relative role of the market and the state and the relative projection of force against commonly agreed upon rivals and foes. This particular moment, from your leaving the White House until now, feels like an incoherent part of that chapter, of that story. Do you agree that you governed in a world that was basically shaped by those two American traditions? And if you agree with it, how does one go about recovering and restoring that conversation?
I think it is correct that despite all the differences, I was listening to Jim talking about Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan going at it. The truth is that during that period you describe, the ideological band of American politics was pretty narrow compared to most other countries. There was a broad consensus around a number of core issues and core principles. And you know, there's a reason why I was comfortable asking, for example, Bob Gates to stay on as my Secretary of Defense when we were still in the middle of two wars. There was a reason why I could consult with a Brett Scowcroft or a Jim Baker about a particular issue comfortably. It wasn't a strain. It was because we had a common baseline of assumptions and values around certain issues. I think what is also true is that that consensus was hugely beneficial to the United States, and that over the course of the post-World War II era, net, it was hugely beneficial to the world. Didn't mean we didn't screw up, make mistakes, weren't hypocritical, weren't self-interested. I mean, we're a nation state governed by politicians, and so the world had all kinds of opportunities at various junctures to say, the United States doesn't believe what it preaches, it's supporting folks who aren't Democrats, they're doing things for convenience, all those things. But at the end of this period of, let's call it 60, 70 years, the world was wealthier, less violent, healthier, more tolerant, more democratic. The average person had, their life chances were improved across the board. I mean, you had billions of people. Look, the Chinese essentially were free riders on the system we built and lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's justifiable for us now to want them to say, stop riding for free. You've got to carry your weight now that your status has changed. But we did something very valuable there. Here's what is also true. What's also true is that, and this is true for any political system, any consensus, that over time contradictions appear and there are things that were not tended to. You know, in the United States, one of the major fault lines in America was always race. And we made halting leaps towards changing our laws and our customs and our culture so that we were more likely at least to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the notion that we're all created equal, despite not getting there. Now, as we started doing that, that consensus starts weakening, right? This is why Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the first thing he says is, we just lost the South for the rest of my lifetime, maybe more. Because he understood that part of that old consensus had tamped down this big contradiction, which is we talk a lot about democracy, but we're not treating everybody the same. Gender. Part of the reason everybody could get along pretty good in Congress in 1957 or 1965 was there weren't any women there to say what you guys are doing is stupid. And suddenly some women show up and they start questioning things, and suddenly men are kind of uncomfortable. Changes the consensus, right? Same with LGBT issues, and right. So within the United States, we had a whole range of issues that were not being addressed as they come up, which is a healthy thing. They couldn't be buried. Suddenly, that consensus feels less comfortable. And when it comes to the economy, part of what happens is that the globalization that, you actually had a consensus between Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and certainly elements of my administration. We wanted to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership done, for example, TPP. The consensus around things like free trade or didn't fully address the fact that although net the whole world was doing better because of globalization and the internet and global supply chains, there were folks whose factories were being closed and suddenly found themselves to be redundant workers. And you suddenly had a winner-take-all economy where back in 1960, maybe the CEO makes 10 times more than the guy on the assembly line. Now suddenly it's 200 times or 300 times. And the capacity of nation states to regulate global capital so that at least they have some control where they say, you know what, let's speed things up, slow things down, let's ease the transition for communities that are being hurt by whether it's automation or foreign competition. That becomes harder to do because everybody's just worrying about what their quarterly reports are going to look like on Wall Street. So now that creates frustrations and contradictions. And I think that I think a legitimate critique of that consensus, of which I consider myself to be a part of and still believe in, is that we did not adapt quickly enough to the fact that there were people being left behind and that frustrations were going to flare up and that all these changes that were happening really quick and you had to address them and speak to them. And in those environments, you then start getting a different kind of politics. You start getting politics that's based on that person's not like me, and it must be their fault. And you start getting a politics based on a nationalism that's not pride in country, but hatred for somebody on the other side of the border. And you start getting the kind of politics that does not allow for compromise because it's based on passions and emotions.
It's
and
identity politics.
Identities and which is why, by the way, you know, when I hear people say they don't like identity politics, they don't like, I think it's important to remember that identity politics doesn't just apply when it's black people or gay people or women.
No.
You know, the folks who really originated identity politics were the folks who said, you know, three-fifths clause and all that stuff. That was identity politics. That's still out there. Maybe that was a little too controversial for Houston, but
no, but
you know, Jim Crow was identity politics. That's where it started. So part of what's happened is that when people feel their status is being jostled and threatened,
yeah,
they react. And what I would agree with is that the Washington consensus, whatever you want to call it, got a little too comfortable with, you know, they're looking at GDP numbers and they're looking at, you know, the internet, and everything's looking pretty great. And then particularly after the Cold War, Jim, you know, after what you guys engineered, you had this period of great smugness on the part of America and American elites thinking, we got this all figured out. Remember, there were books coming out, that's the end of history. And you know,
the end of history.
Yeah.
Francis Fukuyama.
It came back to bite us. So, I don't know, that was kind of a long lecture there, I'm sorry. That's good. We're just trying to have a after dinner conversation. I should have thrown a joke in there or something.
No. Mr. Secretary, what do you want us to remember most about your public service legacy?
You mean what am I most proud of about my public service legacy? I suppose, John, I'm most proud of the fact that I had the privilege of serving 2 presidents of the United States as Chief of Staff. I had the privilege of being Secretary of the Treasury. I had the privilege of being Secretary of State. I had the privilege of running 5 presidential campaigns for 3 Republican presidents and spending 12 years in Washington and leaving Washington unindicted.
That was something there. Good job, sir. I give you credit.
I think that's right. I think Susan gets the credit for that, sir. But, Mr. President, what about you?
He stole my answer.
Let me just say, of your 8 years, what do you want us to think about in terms of your president? Your life is unfolding, of course, but the president.
Well, look, there are obviously accomplishments that I'm extraordinarily proud of and believe deeply in. I think the Affordable Care Act was important. It was incomplete, but it was a starter house on the path to a smarter, more rational healthcare system where we're not spending 6, 8, 10% more than other advanced countries for worse outcomes. And I was extraordinarily proud of the Paris Accords because, look, I know we're an oil country, and we need American energy, and by the way, American energy production. You wouldn't always know it, but you know, it went up every year I was president. And you know, that whole suddenly America's like the biggest oil producer and the biggest that was me, people. I just want you to it's a little like, you know, sometimes you go to Wall Street and folks will be grumbling about anti-business. And I said, have you checked where your stocks were when I came in office and where they are now? What are you talking? What are you complaining about? Just say thank you, please. because I want to raise your taxes a couple percent to make sure kids have a chance to go to school. But all those things, I really would put as secondary to a variation on what Jim said, which is Michelle and I and our girls, we came out intact. And what I mean by that is that the core values that we brought into the office, pretty homespun values, tell the truth and try to see the other person's point of view and treat people kindly and with respect and work hard and think things through we were able to sustain that in a difficult environment for that to sustain. And not only did I not get indicted, nobody in my administration got indicted, which, by the way, was the only administration in modern history that can be said about. In fact, nobody came close to being indicted, partly because the people who joined us were there for the right reasons. We were there to serve, but I guess there's a larger point to that, and I'm in the process of writing right now, and the first time I was in the Oval Office was actually after I'd been elected. I had been to the White House, but I hadn't been to the Oval Office. I'd been there for several meetings. But the tradition is, shortly after the election, the current president invites his successor in. So 43, he has me over. Laura's with Michelle. They could not be more gracious. And I have to make the point that they had set up a transition process that was flawless and generous and thoughtful, so that every member of 43's staff had made themselves available to the person who was going to be taking their place and had prepared manuals and books about how things work. And because despite the political differences, which were real and significant, they recognized there was a value above those differences. And when I walked into the Oval Office, there's a reverence there for that office that is independent of you. And if you don't feel that, then you shouldn't be there. Because because a lot of fights, a lot of sacrifices, a lot of bloodshed is represented in that office. And not just soldiers at Iwo Jima, it's maids in Selma, and it's workers in a coal mine, and it's farmers in the Dust Bowl, and that you're carrying that vessel, and I never lost that reverence for that office. And every day I would come and I would say, I'm going to make mistakes. There are going to be decisions that are compromises. Jim knows this. When you're in that office, there is never such a thing as a 100% solution, because by definition, if it was easy to solve, somebody else would have solved it. It only comes to you when when there's no good answer. But through all those ups and downs, you had to have a part of you, and the Bushes had that, and Ronald Reagan had that, and Bill Clinton had that. that sense of, man, this is sacred. This is important.
Yeah.
And there's a civic religion and a set of ideals and principles that we won't get perfect, but we should strive to perfect. And that, I think, is something I never lost throughout the time I was there. There was never, my staff we used to put stickers on people's binders and folders saying, guard against cynicism. Because you have to be realistic, but you can't be nihilistic and serve whether you're president, secretary of state, or a young staffer who's there for the first time.
I want to close, if I may, by giving Ronald Reagan the last word, which is always safe.
Well, in this crowd, anyway.
Not far from here in Secretary Baker's office, there's a picture of Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Treasury at that time, Baker, sitting next to President Reagan. The picture was taken by David Hume Kennerly, the great political photographer, in 1987. President Reagan looks a little puzzled, and he's in Reagan's wonderful handwriting. The inscription reads as follows: "Dear Jim, I look like I'm lost, but not worried. You'll straighten it out like you always do." Ronald Reagan. I think I speak for all of us when I thank both Secretary Baker and President Obama, because they've straightened out a hell of a lot for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.